Okay, let's talk about the uterus. First of all, you have to be able to find it on midsagittal section. Even when I teach people this, they still misidentify the uterus. So the urinary bladder is here. It's closer to the pubic symphysis. And the uterus is here. In a woman who's not pregnant, the uterus sort of folds over the urinary bladder. Okay. And of course, the uterine tubes and ovaries are lateral, a little superior to the uterus. So that's it on a mid-sagittal section. Here's the uterus. And also, let's make sure that you know. So here's the rectum, right? Here's the uterus. Posterior, superior to the urinary bladder. It's hollow. It's really thick walled. It's got a whole bunch of smooth muscle in the wall, and it's relatively small except during pregnancy. It's about the size of a small pear in a woman who has never been pregnant. In a woman who has had a pregnancy, it's going to be larger, and it's going to be larger even after the pregnancy has been delivered. Okay, so let's look at the parts of the uterus. Okay, this top portion right here is called the fundus. It's the dome-shaped region above the uterine tubes. And then the biggest portion in the middle right here is called the body of the uterus, and the lumen would be inside of it. So the body is here, the lumen is inside there. And then this narrow restricted region down here of the uterus, right here, is called the isthmus. And it's between the body and the cervix. And then the cervix is this region right here that projects into the vaginal canal. It has lots and lots of collagen to hold it together. So let's find the supports of the uterus. And the supports of the uterus, so you have these muscles right here. These muscles of the pelvic floor, which are called the pubococcygeal muscles, or the perineal muscles, or the Kegel muscles, those help to support the uterus. And then we have some ligaments that help to support it as well. So we have, let's see, the ligaments, the lateral cervical or cardinal ligaments, those go from the isthmus. These are transverse cervical. I'll change it in your notes. The transverse cervical ligament right here. It really is primarily about holding onto the vagina, but can hold there as well. And then the round ligaments, you can see this round ligament right here. The round ligaments go from the fundus of the uterus toward the pelvic wall, and they actually run through the inguinal canal and insert onto the labia majora, which doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense in females. But in males, since these are homologous structures, going out on the outside will make sense. Okay, so let's talk about the tissue layers of the uterus. So we're not going to go into a ton of detail here, but if you look at the wall of the uterus, the serous membrane on the outside is going to be the perimetrium. It's just a serous membrane, visceral peritoneum. And then a really, really thick layer of myometrium. And the myometrium is 3 layers of really thick, smooth muscle. And of course, the contraction of that myometrium will help expel the fetus during childbirth, or expel the endometrium during menstruation when that contract's not necessarily very comfortable. And then the inner layer right here is called the endometrium. And the endometrium has 2 sublayers to it. This basal layer right here, you keep that all the time, but every single cycle, a reproductive age woman will make a new functional layer. And then if implantation occurs, then the functional layer will stay there throughout the pregnancy. And if implantation does not occur, then that functional layer will slough off and she will menstruate it every single time. So when you menstruate, you're actually not menstruating just fluid. It's not just blood. It's really vascular tissue. It is this layer of the endometrium every single time. Okay, blood supply to the uterus. The uterus is primarily supplied by the internal iliac arteries that give rise to a branch called the uterine arteries, and that runs through the broad ligament, and you're seeing it right here. So a couple of little clinical notes. One of them is endometriosis. Okay, endometriosis is a really, really confusing and sometimes debilitating disorder. So what you're looking at here is you're looking at the uterus, right? and you're looking at the ovaries right here, okay? And this is a typical healthy female reproductive system. But with the endometriosis, what happens is when this tissue, this functional layer of the endometrium, starts to grow under high levels of progesterone, typically in a healthy woman, it would be limited to the inside of the uterus. But in a woman with endometriosis, for some reason, it does not limit itself to growing in here. It starts to grow in the tubes. And since the tubes are open, it can even grow outside. It can grow on the ovary. It can irritate your reproductive organs. It can irritate the outside of your uterus. It can grow on your urinary bladder. And then when the progesterone level drops in a woman during her, to trigger menstruation, that tissue is going to try to slough off. And when it sloughs off the inner wall here, it's really evolved to do that. But when it sloughs off here, it can cause damage and pain, and a lot of irritation and redness and potentially infertility. So in this one, you've got a healthy reproductive tract. In this one, you can see all the inflammatory response because of endometriosis. And it's a really confusing disease. It's almost akin to a cancer, but it can't grow any further than the abdominopelvic cavity. It doesn't go past the diaphragm or anything, but it can grow all over your reproductive organs, and it can cause fertility relatively quickly in a woman. The only other thing that I want to talk about is cervical cancer. So here's the cervix, it's just this little region right here. And for some reason, this little region has a relatively high instance of cancer, especially when exposed to certain specific STIs. So cervical cancer is the third most common gynecological malignancy. It's the 8th leading cause of cancer-related deaths in women. But when cancer occurs in the cervix, it's a relatively slow-growing cancer. So if a woman is having regular reproductive care, even an abnormal indication of like pre-cancer, generally can be treated relatively well and relatively successfully. So what happens is when you go in for your yearly exam, they'll take a little brush, they'll stick it up and they'll scrape some cells off of the epithelium of your cervix. And then a good pathologist, which is really just a histologist who's really studied abnormal and normal histology, will look at the difference between the cells that were taken and normal epithelial cells. This is normal cervical epithelial cells, and these are abnormal cervical epithelial cells. This could be an indication that cervical cancer is on the way. It doesn't necessarily mean that cancer has existed, and I certainly shouldn't be doing any diagnostics anyway. But this would be, for instance, an abnormal screen. And when they actually do this process of scraping the cervix and then sending it off to a pathologist, this is actually called a Pap Smear, named after the guy who found it or who developed it, somebody Papanicolaou, and it increases the likelihood of early detection. So what does HPV, human papillomavirus, which is not why it's called a Pap Smear, have to do with this? When a woman is exposed to HPV, especially certain strains of HPV, what those do is they increase the likelihood of developing cervical cancer. So women who are sexually active are more likely to get this. HPV is asymptomatic in most people, which is one of the reasons why a yearly screen and a yearly Pap smear can help to let a woman know that she has the predisposition or abnormal cell division. And in women who get cervical cancer now, more than 50% of them have never had a Pap smear. So it's not like a Pap smear prevents cervical cancer, but it usually catches it a lot of times in the precancerous stage when you can either scrape it off or ablate it off or burn it off, and then you just do more frequent checks to make sure it doesn't come back. So this is a life-saving screening. Okay, I'll stop there.